The Jordan Peterson on BBC Question Time last night, it's a panel show format. It's not ideally suited to Jordan Peterson. He likes to talk for an hour, 2 hours just on one subject. Although he did make some good points across, the BBC didn't really give him that much screen time and really didn't give him many opportunities to make counter arguments to other people's points. But all in all, it was good to see him on mainstream British TV. Anyway, so these are the clips. Hope you like them. I'll see you in the next video.
Well, if you're approaching this problem from the perspective of the social scientist, what you'd try to do is to track down the multi-factors that are at play. So who's doing it? That would be age range primarily, and likely gender, because the probability that it's all males is extremely high. Why are they doing it? Why has it accelerated in recent years? What do they gain from it? That's a major element of it. There's something going on there. Is it self-protection? Is it status? And so you want to do a causal analysis of the problem, and then you can target the solution properly. And the problem with like stop and search, for example, and this has already been touched upon, is that these are low probability events. So you end up stopping and searching a far larger number of people than are ever going to be involved in any crime. And then that produces side effects like accusations of racism or perhaps actual racism. We've seen that sort of thing happen in New York and in Toronto when stop and search and that, and analogs of that were attempted to be implemented. But I'd like to know why it's happening. That's the first thing, because it's hard to solve a problem unless you've got the diagnosis right.
Okay. Search. It's not very nice, and it just aggravates the way that you feel towards the police and so on as well.
You see it. So generally speaking, the people who are most likely to be violent are young men. And the violence that drives young men is often a consequence of status competition. And so one of the things that you see is that when societies are structured so that young men have a hard time finding a route to status that's say, positive and properly social, that they'll turn to status contests that are violent. And so that's another element to doing the causal analysis properly, is that if violent crimes are on the rise, the probability is high that young men who are ambitious are having a hard time moving up the status hierarchy, and then they use other means to attain notoriety even. And that can be a powerful psychological payoff.
You agree with that? I think that's partly true, but I think we can overanalyze what's actually going on in the
Well, some advice from a Canadian, I would say. Like, we've just about split our country 3 times with referenda. And the one thing I would suggest is that it's not a very good way of governing your country. It's like you can't tell when the damn things, you can't tell when they're binding. You can't tell when public opinion has shifted enough so that another referendum is necessary. You get endless arguments about whether the wording was appropriate. It's like you elect representatives to the House of Parliament to make decisions for a reason, and then when you turn that decision-making power sort of in an arbitrary and unplanned way back to the general populace, I mean, I know they're sovereign and all that, but it's a very bad way of governing the country. And so I think you're in this mess because David Cameron abdicated his I know in Scotland the police had put up advertisements in the tube encouraging people to turn people in for offensive behavior online. It seems to me, for example, if you're concerned about knife crime, then maybe one of the things you don't want to do is have your police investigating offensive speech. And one of the things I do see happening in the UK as an outsider that's really quite terrifying to me is that there are increasing restrictions put on people's ability to speak forthrightly, and that the consequence of that restriction and the criminalization of what hypothetically constitutes offensive speech is going to be a cure that's so much more worse than the disease that we can hardly imagine it. It's a dreadful thing to see that happening in the UK. And so, I mean, people say things that are reprehensible all the time, but we can't always agree on what they are. But to start to criminalize that's hypothetical.
Are you saying nothing that anybody says should ever be counted as a crime?
Well, there's incitement to crime. That should be counted as a crime and has been for a very long time in the British common law tradition. But other than that, you should be very careful about what you regulate as speech. Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to define hate? That's the real issue. It's not that there's not hate. There's plenty of it. The question is, who defines hate and how is it prosecuted?
I'm not... When you talk about who's going to define hate, you want to see the letters and emails I see day after day and tell me that's not hate.
I didn't... Wait a second. Now, hang on a second.
John. Yes.
Okay.
There was some... No, well, hang on. There was somebody fined under the Communications Act earlier this year because he posed a video on YouTube of a dog doing a kind of Nazi salute, and he shouted in the background, "Gas the Jews." And that was, he was fined, and it was a criminal prosecution. Is that right in your view?
I didn't think that was right, no. I think it was a big mistake. I mean, I followed that case fairly clearly, fairly carefully, and you don't have to agree that what he did was comical or right, but to prosecute him criminally was a big mistake, and you're going to pay for it in this country.
Today...
We have to stop there, I think. Diane, briefly, just on that, as...
I would say that type of video with somebody shouting "kill the Jews" is an incitement to racial hatred, and now that's a crime.
Okay.